With Israel back in the news, it also brings into the spotlight once again a program that many, perhaps most American Jewish families these days know about, a program called Birthright. Birthright is a program in which the sons and daughters of American Jewish families are invited at the program's expense to visit Israel, and some have called it an educational experience, others have called it an indoctrination of a political nature. Our next guest is a veteran of the program themselves, and also walked off, protested while on a Birthright trip. So we wanted to talk to them about that experience now. And Noah Wagner is associated with the young Jewish group, If Not Now. They are a recent college graduate living in the Boston area and brought the If Not Now organization, or helped bring it, to the Harvard campus, and they join us now. So Noah, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let's start with this. You went on the Birthright trip yourself, is that right?
Right. And partway through the trip, along with 7 other participants on my trip and another trip, we made the decision to walk off. And I'm really looking forward to sharing where that came from, what made us feel we needed to stand up in that moment.
Yeah, your action, you and the other 6, gained an enormous amount of press attention here, around the world, and most of all in Israel, and of course where it was extremely controversial, to say the least. But yeah, I would like to know, because there were a number of different kind of accounts being passed around, this suggestion somehow that maybe you were planted or something. How did this come to be? How did you come to, first of all, make the decision to go on a Birthright trip and then to walk off?
So I made the decision personally to go on this trip because I was hoping to learn more about this complex place that so many Jews have a deep and sometimes multifaceted, complicated connection to. I felt that as I was getting more in touch with my Judaism, which I have been over the past few years, it felt really vitally important that I engage with this complicated place. And I think a moment in which that started to feel really critical for me is this past Passover. For me, that's really one of the places where I see my Judaism being present since I was a child. I thought of myself as being raised pretty secular, but looking back, I think I learned a lot about Jewish values and Jewish history in a way that profoundly shaped me at the Seder table every year. And this year in particular, having found a really beautiful and sort of revitalized Jewish community in places like If Not Now with other young Jews, I sat down at the Seder table, had a wonderful meal with my family, lots of singing and all of that. And I had, put my phone away to avoid engaging too much with the outside world during that time with family. And as the meal was ending and I, got up to check my phone, I saw a news alert that over a dozen Gazan protesters had just been shot by Israeli snipers. And in that moment, I felt a real rift between the Judaism I found at the Seder table with my family and what I saw happening on the ground in those very same moments with people protesting against the occupation and being met with that kind of violence. And I felt that was something I personally needed to deeply explore. So I came on Birthright, hoping to hear a nuanced and complex story, hoping to really push to get that where I'd heard many friends come back saying they hadn't received that on Birthright. They'd received a one-sided pro-occupation narrative and that was coming from a particular political agenda. And I really wanted to challenge that. I wanted to ask hard questions. I wanted to push back when I saw misinformation or bias really shape the way that everyone on the trip was learning about Israel for the first time. I feel very strongly that if tens of thousands of people, of young Jews, go on Birthright trips every year, and that's often their first exposure to Israel and a moment in which they become really concerned with their Jewish identity, Birthright has a tremendous responsibility to be honest, to show us the truth, which I feel we deserve as young people coming into adulthood
Well,
in the
I,
Jewish community.
I've had the impression for a while that the Birthright program, that one of its purposes is to engender in a new generation of American Jews sympathy, not just for the history or traditions of Israel and the Jewish people, but of the government as it exists today and the policies as they exist today, which more and more American Jews are coming to object to. So I've felt for a long time that it had a political dimension to it, and it sounds like that was your experience. Absolutely, right?
That is what I encountered, and I suspected that I might, and I hoped I wouldn't. But when I arrived and made an attempt to ask questions and was told this is not a political trip, this is what's available to us, stop pushing, I found that really disheartening. I was raised in a tradition that encourages us to ask questions, to take multiple perspectives seriously, to deal in complexity and nuance, and I was being asked not to do that. And as I thought more and more about it, both during my research leading up to the trip, and some realizations I had during it, I began to see that it's not a coincidence that Birthright is the largest source of Israel education for tens of thousands of young Jews every year, and that so many of them come out with a very narrow understanding of right and wrong in the context of Israel-Palestine. And to me, that is related to the fact that Birthright's funders have a pro-occupation agenda. People like Sheldon Adelson, who support Birthright heavily, he's donated $200 million in the last several decades, have also heavily backed Trump and have heavily backed the Jerusalem embassy move that Trump pushed for against the wishes of the international community and the Palestinians. It's not a coincidence that the same people who are deeply invested in Trump's and Netanyahu's pro-occupation sort of agenda are also deeply invested in making sure that's carried out on Birthright. And I found that really deeply disturbing. And I was especially disturbed on the day I decided to walk off the trip, when we were scheduled to visit the Davidson Center, which is an archaeological tourist site operated by the Elad Foundation. Now, the Elad Foundation is a far-right pro-settler organization that essentially would be using the money from my entrance fee to fund the continued eviction and displacement of Palestinian families from their homes in East Jerusalem, in partnership with the Jewish National Fund, which so many American Jews have considered to be a sort of innocuous tree planter, is actually planning to uproot all of these families. And I felt that I could not justify walking into that building, into that tourist site, and just tacitly supporting pushing families out of their homes. So that's the day on which I decided, along with one other person on my trip and 6 from another trip, that to walk out and go see the occupation for ourselves, and stand up to the pro-occupation agenda that people like Adelson are pushing with their money.
And how did people receive you? And again, we're talking with Noah Wagner, who walked out of their Birthright trip recently. So Noah, how did people treat you when you went you went to the West Bank? You said, right? So how were you received there? How did that go? What was that experience like?
First, I want to note how I was received on the trip by fellow participants. And I think it's really notable that while the tour guide and trip leaders were sort of displeased with our decision, all of the other participants, many others, came forward to let me know that they really admired and respected our decision to leave, and that they hoped we were able to find some of the truths that they were not being shown on the trip. And the other group that walked off that same day, their group actually applauded them for taking a stand and sort of making this really simple moral choice. And then once we left, we were supported by people from If Not Now and people on the ground in Israel, Palestine, who really sprang into action when we reached out and made the choice to leave the trip. And they made sure that we were able to see all sorts of things that Birthright would never have shown us, would never have wanted us to see. So we were welcomed in a number of Palestinian communities and Bedouin villages where a lot of families are facing ongoing threats of demolition, repeated demolitions. One man told us that he could live with his house being demolished once a year. That seemed livable. But the current rate was more like 4 times a year. And so we met with a lot of people who were very eager to receive us and were very hopeful that we could stand with them in making their story heard in the international community, that we would bring their stories back and share them widely. And all of those stories, all of those realities were things that Birthright was actively obscuring, not mentioning that we were driving past the West Bank, having an explicit policy that doesn't allow participants to hear from Palestinians. And, that's deeply disturbing to me. And I'm very, very grateful that we had the experiences we had. I'll say one exception to how we were received was by settlers in Hebron, who, when we were touring, actually harassed and intimidated us through paint on our tour guide, and generally created a very unsafe atmosphere for a group of young people trying to learn about the occupation. That taught me a lot about what the occupation does to people.
Yeah, and also there's been a lot of violence generated from the settler community that gets underreported in this country. So while I'm sorry you went through that experience, I honestly can't say that I'm terribly surprised. Noah, one of the things you hear, and we've been hearing it for some of us for 40 or 50 years, is that if you object to the occupation, if you object to the violence imposed both structurally as well as directly on Palestinians and so on, if you're Jewish, you're told you're a self-hating Jew. If you're not Jewish, you're told you're just straight up anti-Semitic. Did you find yourself on the receiving end of that kind of criticism too, either in Israel or here in the States?
I'll say that primarily where I received that kind of really heartbreaking hate was on Facebook, when I sort of shared our story and noted that Birthright had canceled our flights and threatened to sue us, and that we were in need of financial support. We put together a fundraiser that many, many people in our community, the Jewish community, I think broadly speaking, and allies came to support. So we were able to raise all of the money we needed to get home in just 2 days. But with all of that publicity came a lot of really vicious comments and threats and accusations of betrayal and of being self-hating Jews. And it really saddens me to see people in my community rejecting me from that community because I'm asking questions, because I'm expressing concern about the humanity of everyone involved in the occupation. And I'm really proud to know that there are other ways of moving forward together as a Jewish community. I think If Not Now in particular has taught me that young people, that our generation has a lot to teach and a lot to bring in terms of approaching this issue with thoughtfulness and compassion and leading us in a direction that is productive and hopeful. So I feel very fortunate to have found that in my generation.
And overall, as I look at the statistics and the numbers in terms of polling, American Jews in general and younger Jews in particular are no longer in lockstep with Israel and its policies. So it seems to me that we're coming to a point of view where Israel, in terms of the occupation, in terms of the shooting of protesters, in terms of the settlement, can no longer count on the unchallenged support of American Jews. And that to me that for me personally gives me a lot of optimism for the future, even though it's terrible. The situation there is so terrible right now for the Palestinians. And you know, I guess the honest way to put it, Noah, is that I vacillate between optimism because of the shifting attitudes of young people and just despair because it seems to me that the situation in Palestine is so grim. We've had Max Blumenthal on showing clips from his film about Gaza and so on. It just seems to me that the president is so desperate that if we can hang on, maybe we could change things in the future. But I worry about the people who can't hang on. Any kind of last thoughts about that?
I will say that I've never been more hopeful, and that's because of the many, many people I've encountered who are committed to seeing our community toward a path of justice and freedom and dignity for all people. And I think that we actually have far more power than we recognize if we only use it as American Jews. You know, if the U.S., an Israeli activist who helped us make all this possible and who works with an organization called Free Jerusalem, told us that if the U.S. decided it wanted the occupation to end, it would end in a week. If the American Jewish community decided that it wanted that, the U.S. would have to make that pivot. And I think that that gives us a tremendous amount of power that we are really called to use in this moment as we see the situation getting more and more clearly unsustainable and not producing safety for anyone. So I would really invite all of us to think about how, particularly American Jews, but also other people who have concern around this, have a great deal of power to hold our institutions that support the occupation, Jewish institutions and American institutions, accountable, and envision a path forward that offers freedom and dignity for everyone.
Well, that sounds like a mission statement to me, and good luck with that. We will certainly help any way we can. Noah Wagner, a veteran of the Birthright program and participant and activist with If Not Now. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.